This is not a story about panic. It is a story about weight. Systems do not collapse the way headlines suggest. They do not shatter in a single moment. They bend. They sag. They redistribute pressure until something foundational gives way quietly, structurally, and often by design. What you are about to hear is not a prediction. It is an interpretation of signals. The public has been trained to watch spectacle. Elections, wars, speeches, rate announcements. These are presented as decisive moments, as turning points. But spectacle is theater. Theater is meant to be seen. And anything meant to be seen is rarely where power actually moves. The real story unfolds elsewhere. In settlement mechanisms, in balance sheets, in reserve compositions, in the choreography of capital flows that never make headlines. Today, the dominant assumption is simple and deeply ingrained, that the US dollar is strong because it is dominant, and dominant because it is trusted. That its role as the world's reserve currency is a natural law rather than a maintained structure. That declines, if they come at all, arrive gradually and without intent. That assumption is no longer supported by the evidence. What we are witnessing now is not dollar weakness in the conventional sense, not market panic, not speculative attack, not loss of confidence driven by emotion. What we are seeing is something colder and far more deliberate, a structural rebalancing that requires the dollar to be worth less materially less than it is today, not because the system is failing, but because the system cannot continue without it. The phrase Plaza Accord is often treated as a historical artifact, a footnote from the 1980s when governments coordinated to weaken the dollar. It is framed as a one-time intervention, a relic of a simpler financial era. That framing is convenient and dangerously incomplete, because the Plaza Accord was not merely an agreement. It was a protocol, a demonstration that reserve currencies are not sacred. They are tools, adjustable instruments within a larger geopolitical architecture. And when the structure becomes unstable, tools are used quietly, precisely, and without public consent. Today, there is no signed communique, no televised announcement, no press conference declaring a coordinated devaluation. And yet, the signals are unmistakable. Policy choices that only make sense if dollar weakness is not an accident. Debt issuance patterns that assume erosion, not preservation. Allied behavior that hedges against volatility while publicly affirming stability. Institutional silence where reassurance would normally be loud. This is not how a system behaves when it expects continuity. This is how a system behaves when it is preparing for adjustment. The Federal Reserve is often described as reactive responding to inflation, employment, growth. That description is incomplete. The Fed is also a custodian of system survivability. And survivability, at this stage, no longer aligns with dollar strength. A currency that is too strong becomes a burden. On debt, on exports, on allies forced to settle in it, on a global system already strained by leverage, sanctions, and demographic drag. The question, then, is not whether the dollar will weaken. The question is whether it can weaken enough, fast enough, and in a controlled enough manner to prevent something worse. A 50% decline does not happen through panic selling. It happens through time, policy, and narrative management, through the normalization of erosion. Inflation reframed as resilience, debt reframed as liquidity, devaluation reframed as adjustment. This matters now, not historically, because the structural constraints have converged. The debt load is no longer theoretical. The interest burden is no longer abstract. The geopolitical environment no longer allows externalization of cost without consequence. And most importantly, alternatives no longer need to replace the dollar to weaken it. They only need to absorb marginal flows. The audience is told to watch for crashes. But crashes are visible. They are loud. They trigger response. What is unfolding now is quieter, more dangerous, and far harder to reverse. This investigation does not assume malicious intent. It assumes rational actors under constraint. It treats policy decisions as signals, silence as data, and timing as evidence. Because when financial architecture shifts, it does not announce itself. It leaves traces. What follows is an examination of those traces, not to provoke fear, but to establish record. Because years from now, this period will not be remembered for what was said. It will be remembered for what was done quietly while attention was elsewhere. This is the Plaza warning. What the data says begin with scale. The United States is carrying a debt load that no longer behaves like conventional sovereign debt. It is too large to repay, too central to default on, and too embedded to restructure openly. That combination produces a narrow set of viable outcomes. One of them is dilution. Debt does not need to be repudiated to be reduced. It only needs to be serviced in a unit that buys less over time. This is not theory, it is arithmetic. Over the last several years, issuance has accelerated even as real demand has become increasingly price-sensitive. Foreign official buyers, once stable absorbers of U.S. Treasuries, have shifted behavior. Not exited dramatically, but reduced marginal participation. The velocity matters more than the totals. At the same time, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet behavior reveals an institution managing contradictions. Official tightening paired with structural accommodation. Public hawkishness alongside backstop mechanisms that never fully disappear. This is not confusion. It is compartmentalization. The data shows that the system is being kept liquid while appearing constrained. That combination only works if the unit of account absorbs the pressure, which it is. Real yields, when adjusted honestly, have been negative more often than public commentary suggests. Currency purchasing power has eroded faster than headline metrics acknowledge. This erosion is not uniform, but it is persistent. Persistence is policy. Why this behavior is abnormal under normal conditions. A reserve currency issuer defends stability. It prioritizes credibility over convenience. It accepts short-term pain to preserve long-term trust. That is not what we are seeing. Instead, we observe tolerance, almost acceptance of erosion. Repeated tolerance. Explained away, normalized, reframed. Inflation targets are treated as flexible. Currency strength is discussed selectively. Debt expansion is justified as necessity rather than risk. These are not the behaviors of a system guarding a pedestal. They are the behaviors of a system preparing to step down carefully. Historically, reserve currency transitions are violent because they are resisted. What makes the current moment distinct is the absence of visible resistance. This suggests coordination, or at minimum, alignment. Strategic interpretation. From strategic standpoint, a weaker dollar solves multiple problems simultaneously. It reduces the real value of debt. It improves export competitiveness. It eases pressure on emerging markets trapped in dollar liabilities. It softens the external perception of dominance without surrendering control. Most importantly, it buys time. Time for infrastructure realignment. Time for supply chain repositioning. Time for allies to adjust exposure without panic. A 50% decline, spread over years, does not feel like collapse. It feels like adjustment. That is the point. Who is absorbing the pressure? Currency weakness does not distribute pain evenly. Domestic savers absorb loss quietly. Foreign holders absorb dilution invisibly. Fixed income participants absorb erosion through yield. Those with access to real assets, pricing power, or policy proximity fare differently. This is not accidental. Systems always protect their cores first. The pressure migrates outward away from decision centers, toward balance sheets that cannot respond. Where the money and resources are going, capital does not vanish when confidence erodes. It relocates into infrastructure, into commodities, into bilateral settlement systems, into assets that sit outside pure monetary abstraction. This is not de-dollarization as revolution. It is reweighting, and reweighting does not require headlines. Why this weakens one side and strengthens the other? A controlled decline preserves initiative. An uncontrolled collapse forfeits it. By managing erosion rather than resisting it, the issuing authority maintains relevance even as nominal dominance fades. Those expecting a sudden break will miss the transition entirely. because by the time it is visible, it will already be complete. What ultimately distinguishes this moment from every cycle that came before it is not magnitude, speed, or volatility. It is permission. In previous eras of financial stress, authorities fought to preserve appearances. They defended currencies, justified models, and reassured markets that deviations were temporary. Stability was framed as a permanent condition, and any disruption was treated as an anomaly to be corrected. That framework no longer holds. Today's system is not defending its old shape. It is preparing to survive without it. This is a subtle but profound shift. Systems do not announce when they abandon legacy assumptions. They simply stop enforcing them. Targets become ranges. Rules become guidelines. Temporary measures become standing facilities. And what once would have triggered emergency language becomes absorbed into routine policy communication. This is how structural change occurs without public rupture. The dollar does not need to collapse to be transformed. It only needs to be reweighted within the system that relies on it. And reweighting is not a market event. It is an administrative process carried out over time through policy tolerance and institutional silence. The most dangerous misconception is that systemic failure arrives as shock. In reality, systems fail first through accommodation. They bend to pressures they can no longer resist, and in doing so, they redefine what normal means. We are already inside that phase. The visible economy still functions. Markets still open. Assets still trade. The machinery hums. But beneath that surface, the assumptions that once anchored valuation, safety, and permanence have shifted. Debt is no longer expected to be retired in real terms. Currency strength is no longer treated as an absolute good. Stability is no longer defined as preservation, but as continuity under erosion. This reframing matters because it alters how risk propagates. Traditional safe havens were built for a world where instability was episodic and external, where crises came from shocks, not design constraints, where capital fled temporarily, then returned. That world no longer exists. When currency dilution becomes a tool rather than a failure, protection becomes conditional. When liquidity is abundant but purchasing power is not, nominal safety loses meaning. When policy priorities shift from defense to management, the old maps no longer describe the terrain. This does not imply conspiracy. It implies exhaustion. Every system eventually reaches a point where maintaining its original configuration requires more energy than adapting it. At that point, erosion becomes preferable to resistance. What we are observing now is not recklessness. It is triage. The dollar sits at the center of a global architecture that has accumulated obligations faster than productive capacity. Demographics constrain growth. Energy transitions impose cost. Geopolitical fragmentation reduces efficiency. Sanctions weaponize settlement channels. And leverage compounds every stressor. Under these conditions, strength becomes a liability. A currency that is too strong amplifies debt burdens. It fractures allies. It concentrates pressure inward. It accelerates instability rather than preventing it. Weakness, by contrast, diffuses pressure outward and forward in time. This is why the coming shift will not look like abandonment. It will look like tolerance. Tolerance of inflation. Tolerance of volatility. Tolerance of declining purchasing power framed as resilience and flexibility. And tolerance, when institutionalized, becomes protocol. The insiders already understand this distinction. Their behavior reflects it. They are not exiting loudly. They are repositioning quietly, extending durations selectively, reducing exposure incrementally, favoring assets and structures that function across regimes, not just within one. These are not reactions. They are acknowledgments. Acknowledgement that the old equilibrium cannot be restored. Acknowledgement that models calibrated to the past no longer resolve forward risk. Acknowledgement that safety is no longer static. The public narrative will not follow immediately. It cannot. Narratives lag structure because they exist to preserve confidence, not to describe reality. By the time a narrative shifts, the system has already moved. That is why watching words is insufficient. Signals reside elsewhere. They reside in what is allowed to drift, in what is no longer defended aggressively, in which imbalances are tolerated and which are corrected, in which institutions are quietly backstopped and which are left exposed. Going forward, confirmation will not arrive as a single event. It will arrive as accumulation. More normalization of what once would have been alarming. More acceptance of what once would have triggered intervention. More emphasis on functioning markets rather than sound money. More discussion of resilience instead of restoration. Each adjustment will appear reasonable in isolation. Together, they will describe a system that has changed its objective. This is why comparisons to past crises are misleading. Those crises occurred within a framework that still believed in return. Return to growth. Return to stability. Return to previous valuations. The current transition does not assume return. It assumes adaptation. And adaptation does not reverse. It only completes. The Plaza Accord was remembered as an event. Its real legacy was precedent, proof that reserve currencies are managed, not sacred. That value can be negotiated downward without chaos, provided the process is gradual and the narrative remains controlled. What we are witnessing now is not repetition. It is evolution. There may never be a signature. There may never be an announcement. There may never be a moment historians can point to as the start, because the start is already past. The only question that remains is pace. And pace is determined not by markets, but by tolerance, political, social, and institutional. As long as erosion is absorbed without destabilizing response, it will continue. When it is no longer absorbed, the next protocol will be introduced. That is how systems persist, not by preserving value, but by redistributing loss in ways that avoid rupture. This analysis does not argue inevitability as fate. It argues inevitability as structure. When architecture shifts under load, outcomes follow physics, not preference. The dollar will not fall because confidence disappears. It will fall because the system requires it to weigh less. And when that realization becomes widespread, it will not feel like revelation. It will feel like recognition. By then, the adjustment will already be embedded. This record exists not to persuade, but to document, to establish that the signals were present, the logic visible, and the trajectory discernible, long before the outcome became undeniable. Structures move first. Narratives follow. History arrives last.